everyone. We'll get started in 1 minute.
Any over this way?
Either way, I've got like a 2 to 3 minute introduction here. Stand right here. That's totally fine. Or you can sit down one or the other.
Yes. You'll be right in front of it.
Okay, everyone, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name's Joshua Benish. I am a staff member within the University of Vermont Office of the Vice President for Research. I support various projects around water resources and UVM's natural areas within the Office of the Vice President for Research. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the 50th anniversary of the UVM Natural Area System. UVM has 10 different properties at different elevational gradients from Mount Mansfield down to Colchester Bog on the shores of Lake Champlain. And this lecture series is really geared toward kind of focusing on all of these different UVM natural areas, the different UVM research forests that we have. We have 4 different UVM research forests. We also have the Proctor Maple Research Center, which may be included in a future reiteration of this series. And we also, as kind of in my role within the UVM natural areas and supporting kind of like the field research that goes on within them and within these properties, I am also supporting a lot of research that's going on one of our key natural areas, which is Mount Mansfield. Mount Mansfield already has over 30 years of long-term monitoring through the UVM-based Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative. And many people don't know that UVM has owned the summit ridgeline of Mount Mansfield since 1859. And the mountain provides many unique opportunities for research, education, and community engagement. And I'm now leading a project for establishing a regional network of mountain observatories in collaboration with the Mount Washington Observatory in New Hampshire and the Whiteface Mountain Observatory in New York. And this network will support emergency preparedness, such as predicting extreme weather events, and also ecological research. And so today it is my pleasure to introduce the first lecture of our Talks and Walks on UVM's Wild Side Lecture Series. The development of this series has been a collaborative effort between many different entities across campus, all of us which collaboratively support field research, instruction, and land stewardship. I'm very thankful to ECHO for providing their space for this public-facing lecture series. I think this is such a great opportunity with ECHO to be able to collaborate on this project, and I hope to support more collaborations between UVM and ECHO in the future, hopefully leveraging some of our UVM lands across the Lake Champlain Basin for educational programs. We also appreciate the financial support of my office, the Office of the Vice President for Research, which helped make this event possible. So for today's lecture, we will start with the theme of mountains, and we have Dr. Steve Keller, who is an associate professor in the Department of Plant Biology in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at UVM. He received his PhD from the University of Virginia. Dr. Keller studies ecological and population genomics, landscape genetics, and forest responses to climate change. He is on a team of researchers from, he is involved with a team of researchers from the University of Maine who recently received a National Science Foundation grant of over $2 million to study alpine plants as a model system for improving forecasts of organismal responses to climate change. He has conducted research on red spruce within the UVM Mount Mansfield natural area, and today Dr. Keller will teach us about the biodiversity and adaptation of alpine plants across the region. So thank you, Dr. Keller.
Thank you, Josh, for inviting me, and Sonia for hosting this really cool series. Honored to be here kicking it off with everybody, and thank you for sharing this little bit of your beautiful evening with me to learn about alpine plants. So yeah, let's get started. So as Josh said, I'm an associate professor at UVM in the Department of Plant Biology. I've been here for 10 years now, shocking to me how fast time goes. And I'm a little bit of a can't sit still for too long in any one discipline type of person. So I'm an ecologist, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I'm a geneticist, and I like to put all those things together and see where they intersect. All with the sort of goal of studying natural populations of plants and how they respond to the environments they find themselves in, especially climate and adapting to climate. And of course with that comes the natural next question of how organisms are going to respond to ongoing climate change. And so I integrate some of that into some forecasting along with our genomic tools. And mostly I've been working on forest trees, but I'm excited to be starting, as Josh mentioned, this project on alpine plants, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So just a little more background for those of you who don't know me. What are the questions that really motivate my lab's research? I'm interested in, on the ecological side, what traits and strategies plants use to adapt to their environment. On the evolutionary side, thinking across longer time spans, across generations, how evolution has shaped populations that grow in different environments, and what's the genetic basis of that adaptive variation. And then lastly, can we use genomic tools and other modeling approaches to make some predictions, hopefully useful to conservation, right? So which populations might be really vulnerable to climate change, and maybe which ones less so? And can we use that to prioritize things? This is a little bit of an old picture. It's good that it's a little dark so you can't see all those faces. But this is my great lab crew from a couple of years ago on a canoe trip down to Winooski. And it's a wonderful team, and a lot of what I'll talk about today has been a collective effort influenced by all of their work. And I would say, for me, it actually started not 10 years ago, but 30 years ago when I did a thru hike at a long trail. And that was my first introduction to really thinking about mountains and mountain ecology and the Alpine. It was the first time I'd ever seen an alpine plant. And it was the coolest thing I think I've ever experienced. And it just made this huge impact on me. And I knew that eventually I wanted to get back to studying these environments that I walked through and to help conserve them and just to better understand them. So today's talk, this photo is probably familiar to many of you now, our beautiful Alpine summit with Catherine Wessel walking towards some of her sites. So we're going to walk along the ridgeline together and think about life above the trees and what adaptations some of these plants have to the alpine. We're going to talk about some of the plant biodiversity in the alpine and how it's reflected in these adaptations. And then along the way, I'll try and highlight some of the ongoing and future research that's coming along with the grant that we just got. So I've sort of pitched the talk not as like a super technical scientific talk, but hopefully it's accessible to a lot of folks. If you have questions as we go, I don't mind being interrupted, so feel free to raise your hand. And yeah, it should be fun. So what is the Alpine zone? Well, let's go to the original Alpine to take a look. So in last year, the academic year 2022-2023, I was on sabbatical and used that time to sort of expand my focus on forest trees to thinking about alpine plants. And so, of course, I had to go to the French Alps. And I've got good friends and collaborators over there. And see where the sort of genesis of alpine studies took place. So this is the Mont Blanc Massif coming in at just under 16,000 feet. So it's actually above the area where plants grow in what we would call the niveal zone. But the Alpine zone, in terms of plant life, is the area above the trees, but below the sort of area of permanent snow line. And I actually took that picture, and I'm going to take a quick diversion here to tell you about a harrowing journey that started down in Chamonix in the valley, about 3,500 feet or so. And you could take a tramway that rises 8,000 vertical feet in a very short period of time to this promontory called the Needle that sits at about 3,800 meters. And I asked Thibaut, my friend and collaborator and former postdoc, as we were arriving, I said, "How did they build this thing?" And he said, "Hopefully with very good materials." And so you get up there, and there are these narrow, icy walkways that you're cautioned not to slip off, which is great. Thank you very much for the safety reminder. But it's just an amazing environment to put yourself in. This area that is basically where glacial ice lives year-round. Highest mountain in the European Alps, and one of the highest in Europe in general. And so just a little fun diversion there, sharing some of my sabbatical visits. But let's get back to the Alpine. So where the plants grow is this sort of band of pink that you can see along some of the major mountain ranges in the world. And of course, as you move poleward in latitude, either north or south, you see that band start to move down. That's because there's a predictable relationship between the length of the growing season and where you are latitudinally, so that where you are in Arctic latitudes, you're basically seeing tundra at sea level, right? And as you get closer to the equator, to have that same growing environment, you have to go up the mountain. And if you'll notice, the blue dotted arrow I put here sits right about 44, 45 degrees north. So this is our area here in northern New England. And so the expectation of the Alpine zone here would be just under 2,000 meters, which puts it at, in the upper 5 to 6,000 feet. And what we'll see, though, is that a lot of our alpine zones in New England are actually below this zone. So it's not just the growing season. Like, there are other aspects of the environment that really create these areas where these alpine plants live.
Is the snow line on that graph?
Yeah, it's the...
Is that the beginning maximum extent of snow?
It's sort of where you start to see permanent snowpack year-round. Yeah. So it's above where the plants are growing. Yeah. One of my favorite plant biogeographers is Alexander von Humboldt, who was a 19th century German botanist and one of the founders of the field of biogeography, the study of where things live and why. And von Humboldt was really instrumental in understanding how life and the communities of plants change across elevations. And he studied different mountain zones throughout the world, from the Andes to the Himalayas, to the Alps and the Pyrenees and beyond. So one of the things, he has these beautiful, famous plates, color plates, that delineate his zones of vegetation. And some of them are human influenced, through land use and cultivation and grazing and things like that. But there's a clear understanding that elevation is driving this change in plant communities. And so he recognized these laser pointers and working so great anymore, so I'll just point to the screen. He recognized these different zones of life and how they changed or turned over as you move up the mountain, move up in elevation. And this alpine zone here below the niveal or the snow zone is where these sort of high altitude plants persist. So coming back a little closer to home, we can also see a lot of evidence of this zonation in our own mountains. And we see it as we look up at the greens or the whites or the Adirondacks or the mountains in Maine. And maybe in the Forest Valley, we're in a northern hardwood forest. And as we move up slightly, we start to see a more montane forest of yellow birch. Maybe there's some red spruce starting to mix in. And as we increase in elevation more, we get into more of this. You can almost see the transition zone here, what an ecologist would call an ecotone. And it's that transition between the hardwoods below and the spruce fir subalpine forest above. And then eventually on the very highest mountains, this is Mount Ave, which has a very small patch of alpine. You get into the land above the trees and the alpine zone. So one of the classic study data sets and long-term monitoring efforts that is part of UVM's tradition takes place on the western slope of Camel's Hump. And it's been really instrumental in our understanding of not only that elevation exerts strong influences on plant communities, but also how those influences change over time, potentially with different anthropogenic influences. And so this is a study started in the 1960s by Hub Vogelman and his PhD student at the time, Thomas Sikkema. And what they did was they set up these plots arrayed along bands of elevation right off the Burroughs Trail on the west slope of Camel's Hump. And you can see the plots in black here. And they go up the mountain, surveying the forest for diversity and composition at different elevational bands. And these have been surveyed every 5 years since first established to track changes over time and space in these communities. And in fact, data from this study was instrumental in the passage of the Clean Air Act. Because it showed that atmospheric pollution in the form of, especially in the form of sulfates downstream from industrial areas of emission were actually acidifying the rain, and we were seeing that impact in the forest. So just to walk you upslope here, here's our northern hardwood forest. Maybe there's a red spruce in here. That's Sonia on the DVH tape. Remember that song? So as we head up a bit, we get into more of a red spruce dominated forest in that ecotone, and then eventually into the high subalpine spruce fir, and the trees start to get smaller, more stunted, and you can start to, that view opens up and you're almost in the alpine at that point. And so this study, this data set has really spurred several important studies, and I'll just share two of them with you here, related to mountains and their influence on alpine or on montane communities. And so the first over here is a study published by a collaborator and colleague of mine at UVM, Brian Beckich, who showed that that position of the ecotone between hardwoods and spruce fir forest actually shifted over time from the start of the study in 1964, the black bars here, until at the time, a recent survey in 2004. So over that period of time, what Beckich et al. Showed was that the northern hardwoods were increasing in frequency in that area of the ecotone shown here in a black bar along the axis here, which is elevation in meters. And the higher elevation spruce fir boreal forest was actually decreasing in time. So it looked like the hardwoods were creeping up and the boreal forest was retreating, right? And we had a signal of what looked like upslope migration of that boreal forest. And using the same data set but building on a larger series of observations collected since this study, we actually have seen spruce colonizing back downslope. So this was a study led by Brittany Verico, who's also here with us today, and published in 2019. And so what Brittany found was that that ecotone was actually relatively stable, and in fact, spruce was recolonizing some of the areas that it had retreated from. And this really looks like sort of a mixture of warming, yes, but also of recolonizing back down slope after past land use change and as the air cleaned up and the impacts of acid rain were reduced. So the message here is that these changes are complex, the responses to environment are complex, and we really need long-term studies in order to be able to see the true arc of what's happening over time. Some more of Brittany's work from her PhD in my lab. She followed up specifically on red spruce and wanted to ask whether the area where red spruce in its range has evolved over many generations, what we would call the provenance of the species, whether the climate of the provenance dictates how well it grows at different elevation sites. And she used a gradient along Mount Mansfield from a low elevation site here at Proctor Maple Research Center outside of Underhill to a mid-elevation site in Underhill State Park, and then at a high elevation site near the Vermont PBS station near the nose on top of the mountain. And she collected provenances, red spruce seed, from all up and down its range here. Each one of these dots is a provenance that she collected seed from. And they varied across this large spatial gradient according to the mean annual temperature, or basically the climate of their source, what they had evolved and adapted to over time. She also collected a similar gradient at a very fine spatial scale from along Mount Mansfield itself, where you can also see almost as big a spread in source climate just from the bottom to the top of the mountain. And what she saw looks like a lot of squiggly lines. And what that squiggly line, what they're telling you is that there's a lot of variation, a lot of genetic variation. Because each line is a different mother tree that produced seeds for her study. And she measured traits like phenology, spring phenology, when they break bud, whether they got cold damaged or not, which you can see they received quite a bit of cold damage at that high elevation garden, how well they grew in terms of their biomass and vertical growth, and some other measures of physiology. And so the takeaway here is that there are big differences in not only the climate that these trees are growing in, where they were planted, but also strong influences of where they come. So they've adapted to different climates within their range. And that really affects how they respond to different areas you plant them out. And also that all of those squiggly lines are basically a visual representation of how much genetic variation is just captured within this one species, right? And so this is what we would call heritability, or the raw material that evolution can select on for adapting to future changes. And one more piece to highlight from Brittany's work is that high elevation site. I don't think red spruce will be establishing anytime soon at the top of the mountain, at least based on this seedling study. And you can see the extreme wind blasting and rime ice formation that these trees experience during wintertime. And variable levels of recovery and growth after that exposure, but it really set them back quite a bit. And Brittany did something interesting, which was calculate the difference in temperature between what they're used to in their source environments and then where she planted them out to, right? And that's what this transfer distance is. So as you move to the left on the graph, that's where you've taken a seed source and planted it someplace colder than it had evolved in. Yeah.
What's the yellow versus the blue on the graph?
Those are, great question. The yellow is this broad geographic sample, and the blue is this local scale sampling. So you can kind of see the influence of, the spatial scale of sampling. And we see that as you move colder and colder, red spruce actually doesn't like it. So we often think of it as maybe a boreal species, but it's really not. It's a montane species. Doesn't like it too warm, doesn't like it too cold. It has its niche that it wants to grow in. And it's probably not going to be moving upslope anytime soon, at least, based on these data. So, sort of using that as a backdrop to think about tree lines and the forces shaping and establishing tree lines. We talked about this elevation relationship, but that according to the biogeography of all the alpine zones in the world, we should only see true alpine in the northeast somewhere between 5,500 feet and above, right? And yet we see alpine zones in Vermont that are, and none of our mountains get that tall. So there are other factors at play. And in fact, just the location of our tree line in the east versus, say, in the Rocky Mountains where tree line occurs, 10, 12,000 feet, is so drastically different. And one of the big influences is our very cold and wet climate in the northeast. And as you move up in elevation, that exposure during winter turns into a lot of rime ice blasting, basically, where the prevailing direction of the wind and the weather, you can see here from the northwest and west, really drives how much exposure these trees are experiencing, this sort of freeze blasting. And so the boundary of the tree line can be variable just with the exposure on the mountain. And so this is a view looking up Sunset Ridge on Mount Mansfield towards the chimney. And you'll see pockets of stunted tree growth showing that blasting well down the ridge line due to the thin soils, the bedrock, and the exposure to the west winds. And it leads to this really interesting tree type of growth called krummholz, or crooked, bent, or twisted wood from the German. And so krummholz is a very characteristic plant growth pattern that you'll observe as you head up in elevation. And it basically reflects the action of the exposure to wind and icing that's really limiting where trees can grow. And so within a short growing season, if trees sustain a lot of damage as a result to their growing tips, to their meristems, and at some point they're no longer able to make enough carbon and meet their demands for the growing season, their energy demands. And so you start to see this transition from a forest to this sort of elfin krummholz forest into true alpine. Another couple of pictures just to illustrate that dynamic here. It's balsam fir on Mount Mansfield, showing that encrusting in rime ice. And then on the right side, it's a little hard to see with the lighting, but this is a almost completely prostrate mat of black spruce, Picea mariana, which is red spruce's sister species, its closest relative. And you might be used to thinking of black spruce as a bog species, which it is. You'll see it in bogs and in muskeg further to the north in Canada. But on our mountaintops, you'll find it growing as a prostrate mat, creeping along, often beneath the snow, where it's has some protection. So let's get above the trees a little bit. So in the northeast, alpine communities generally start to occur around 4,000 feet or so, but as we said, this varies with exposure and aspect. And you can start to get into these treeless communities, although you will still see some evidence of Krumholtz patches even above tree line, true tree line, where there's some protection from wind, like in the leeward areas of rocks and outcrops. And the history of these alpine areas is, geologically speaking, actually kind of recent. They haven't always been there because this entire area was covered in continental ice, the Laurentide ice sheet, which hit its maximum extent about 21,000 years ago, right at the end of the Pleistocene. And so Mount Mansfield completely covered in ice during that time period. There are some areas of higher mountains that protruded above glacial ice to form what are called nunataks, or sort of islands above the glacial ice, where some plants are thought to have persisted during the Ice Age. But in our area, the ice was too thick and the mountains weren't high enough to support nunataks. So this entire area was glaciated, and then during glacial retreat, as the climate started to warm after that Ice Age was done, by about 15,000 years ago, parts of New England start to become ice-free. And you start to see in the pollen record, where paleobotanists can go and take cores from bogs and lakes and look at what plants were present based on the pollen they left behind. They start to see evidence of the alpine flora establishing around 13,000 years ago, which seems like a long time to us, but again, geologically speaking, is like last week. And you can still see evidence, in modern areas of glacial retreat of plants colonizing the sort of barren rubble left behind by these glaciers. And so these are, there's no soil development, right? I mean, these are what we would call primary succession. It's barren ground. These plants are dealing with a lot of exposure and very typically low nutrients and a high degree of exposure to the elements. So 13,000, 12,000 years ago, our alpine flora started to colonize the Northeast. And as the climate continues warming, those plants basically migrate upslope, right? And colonize the highest mountains until what you see on the map today in black here are basically the sort of relics of alpine area that we have in New England. And so they're the areas that maintain the highest elevations and support alpine plant life. And this flora has really strong affinities with the Arctic, actually much stronger with the Arctic than it does with, for example, the Western Rocky Mountain alpine flora. And so you'll see a lot of species in common with Labrador and northern Canada, with Greenland, with Swedish Lapland, and other areas of northern Europe. So within Vermont, we have 3 areas of alpine, and by far the largest in terms of aerial extent is on Mount Mansfield, where the Mansfield Natural Area is. It's sort of the kickoff for this series. So you're looking here towards the Chin, which is 4,393 feet. And the summit ridgeline here supports both a broad spruce fir forest here in this sort of teal color, and also where you see the darker purple, a lot of subalpine Krumholtz on top of the ridge. And then about 200 acres or so, little less, of true alpine species, true alpine vegetation type. There's also Alpine on Camel's Hump at 4,083 feet, about 10 acres or so, with fewer species than exist on Mount Mansfield, but still quite significant. And then, as I mentioned, there's a small patch at about 4,006 feet on Mount Abraham, too, in the Lincoln Range. And so just to share with you some of the plant friends that you may find up there. So this is one of my favorites, Diapensia laponica, which Linnaeus, the well-known plant taxonomist, actually named after Swedish Lapland. That's where the specific epithet comes from, laponica. So this is a what we would refer to as a true cushion plant, a true Arctic alpine species. And you can see it has this very dense growth habit of, that almost resembles a pin cushion. And these very thick, cuticled, waxy leaves that resist desiccation, resist drying out. And this cushion growth form is actually a great example of convergent evolution in alpine plants, by which I mean evolution of a form that lots of different species, lots of different lineages have independently evolved because it solves a certain problem. And this cushion growth form that Diapensia exhibits basically elevates the temperature at the plant level. And so while the microclimate around the plant may be much colder, at the plant level, which is where all of the photosynthesis and respiration is happening, the temperature is actually raised above ambient. And that's what you can see in this graph here. So it shows the relationship between air temperature and plant temperature. And that cushion growth habit really increases that. And just a couple of other plant cushion growth form types on the right there to illustrate that Diapensia is, one species of many that does this, and you can find them all over the world. Okay.
What is plant temperature? How is that measured?
Plant temperature, you can basically take the temperature of the plant. You've seen those like infrared temperature guns. You can take, your own temperature, the temperature of a surface. So you can measure it that way, or you can put a thermocouple at the surface of the plant. But it's what's right at the leaf, what the plant's experiencing. Another one of my favorites that you can find on Mount Mansfield is Salix uva ursi, the bearberry willow. And so this is a species that for me represents resilience personified, because this particular individual has been photographed back at the turn of the century, the 1900s, that is. And has been growing out of this crack in the rock for 100 years. It's really amazing. And so willows are woody, obviously long-lived perennials in this case, and they're able to persist through all of the fluctuations, the seasonal fluctuations and the decadal ones too, through their long growth habit. What's really interesting about most willows too is that they're dioecious. They have separate male and female individual genders. And so this particular individual is a female, and maybe waiting for when it's going to get some pollen and you can actually set seed. We'll see. You have to wait a long time if you're the only one on the mountain. Another woody shrub, low-growing, prostrate, which is another adaptation to this difficult environment, is Vaccinium viticidius. So this is the mountain cranberry, or what they would say in Europe as the ligonberry. And so this is another long-lived, creeping, woody perennial. This is in the heath family. And another related Vaccinium, also in the heath family, is Vaccinium uliginosum, the bog bilberry. And so these species are all woody perennials. So they basically, each season, go dormant and keep all of their above ground parts in a dormant state with buds set, ready to go the next year. And so they're survivors of the really harsh winter environment that you see in the Alpine. This species is a herbaceous plant, Subaldiopsis tridentata, so it's not truly woody, but it is evergreen, so it stays green even throughout the winter, and allows it to begin photosynthesizing as soon as temperatures warm up again and take advantage of that short growing season thing. So this is family, the previous species were in the heath family, this one's in the rose family. And then one of my favorites, one that I remember seeing when I hiked the long trail, is Minuardia grenlandica, the Greenland or mountain stitchwort. And so this is another herbaceous plant that's a true colonizer. You'll see it especially along trails and other areas of disturbance where it will colonize and sort of take on new areas of exposed substrate. And then, in addition to these herbaceous plants, there's also many what we refer to as graminoids, so grasses and sedges and rushes. This one's a relatively common one in the Alpine in the northeast, Carex bigelowii, bigelow sedge, where it forms beautiful sedge meadows, particularly in wet areas, slightly moist areas. And the grasses and the sedges and the rushes, as well as many of the herbaceous plants, unlike the woody strategy of setting buds above ground and developing a true depth of cold hardiness, they do a trick where they actually hide their meristems below the ground, where it isn't exposed to the same freezing temperatures. And so they'll resprout their meristems each spring. They'll resprout growth from those below ground meristems, and thereby sort of avoid some of the worst exposure to the elements that way. So there's many different tricks to dealing with the cold and short growing season. But you can't always avoid it. And so what we see is actually many of these plants, as you might expect, are able to tolerate really freezing temperatures at almost any time of year. And so this is a Diapensia cushion encrusted in snow and ice before it's really broken dormancy in the spring. You can see it's got this sort of almost dark purplish red color, which is the expression of anthocyanins, the same plant pigment that gives blueberries their color. And it's a phytoprotectant, so it helps protect the plant's persistent leaves from too much solar radiation during the portion of the year where it's not able to respire and cool itself off. And so we see even during this graph on the right here is for an area in the Swiss Alps where they looked at the amount of freezing tolerance in July in the Swiss Alps. And most plants, even at lower elevation, maintain some ability to withstand freezing temperatures to, anywhere from like -2 to -5°C. But the alpine plants maintain a deeper depth of that freezing resistance because it can come at any time of year, even during the growing season. So we talked about different ways to avoid those challenges of the growing season. Another option is to choose your microsite carefully. And one of the intriguing parts of mountains is that they topographically are very heterogeneous, right? There's lots of different nooks and crannies, lots of different small valleys and outcrops, and those can lead to microscale differences, on the order of feet and meters. That result in large temperature changes, almost as much as you might see moving more substantially up and down the mountain. And that's what you can get from that thermal imaging. This is a study done taking lots of different sensors placed in a fine grid on the mountain. just to show you the amount of thermal variability there is. So when we think about climate and climate change affecting alpine plants, often what we're have available to help answer those questions are these sort of very coarse scale climate information. But I think there's actually a lot of resilience in the alpine because of this microsite variation. There's a lot of nooks and crannies where plants can retreat to. And just to showcase some of that and the heterogeneity that you can see in substrate and aspect above tree line. So here's a dry diapensia cushion style community, windswept, low moisture availability, high exposure to the elements. And then where you have a little bit more protection from the wind and the weather, you get these snowbed communities where snow accumulates late, things melt late, and you actually have some lower elevation species that actually will persist above tree line in these snowbed communities because there's enough shelter. And another example of this is the Alpine rill community. A rill is a stream, basically. So these are areas where springs well up on the mountain and create abundant moisture and the type of microsites that can really enhance and support this biodiversity. So the mountains are full of different niches within them, and that adds a lot of resiliency to these communities. So I want to end by sharing with you a couple of data tales from Mount Mansfield that helps illustrate its role in our larger alpine flora. So one study was done by Andrea Terrell during her master's thesis at the University of Maine. And she studied Mount Mansfield along with many of the other high mountains in the Northeast to ask whether these peaks were basically accumulating and losing biodiversity as if they were islands in an ocean that maybe were a different size and different degree of isolation from each other. And this really harkens back to some classic ecology and biogeography theory by MacArthur and Wilson, known as the theory of island biogeography, which they originally envisioned as in an oceanic context, oceanic islands, but you can really think of this as islands of habitat in a broader context, right? And so alpine zones can be islands to the extent that they're isolated from each other and lack connectivity through dispersal. Ponds can be islands. Even forests, especially as we fragment them, can become islands. And one of the predictions of island biogeography theory is that the size of the island and the distance of islands from each other and maybe from the mainland is going to shape their species diversity, their species richness. And we predict that larger islands like this one are going to be able to support a greater number of species than a smaller island, and that the distance of islands from each other and from the mainland will also affect that diversity. And so Andrea took inventory data using these very simple PVC style quadrats, 1 meter on an edge, where you inventory the identity and the relative abundance of all of the different plants within each plot. And by measuring many replicate plots like this on many different mountains, she was able to look at how the diversity of different mountain communities co-varied with the size of the alpine patch, the island size, and their degree of connectivity. And what she found was that, in general, alpine islands do behave according to this island biogeography theory. The relationship has a lot of variability in it, like you'd expect from ecological data. But in general, the more islands are connected to each other, the closer they are together, the more any given island tends to support a rich flora, probably because of dispersal, exchanging species. And likewise, as the size of the island goes up, its area, we also see a positive relationship. So fast forward now to thinking about global change. And this is from last December. And I thought, well, what was happening during my long trail hike? Well, just since my long trail hike in '94, 30 years ago, we see a really drastic increase in global temperatures. And in the Northeast in particular, the mountains are showing this too, and most sensitively during the winter. And so these plots are for temperature during the cool season of the year, between November and May. And we see both the high temps and the low temps during winter are both increasing and are predicted to increase towards the end of the century. And precipitation is actually going up, although the amount that falls as snow is coming down and predicted to continue to go down. So that's sort of the nature of the prediction for our climate through the end of the century. And in fact, Catherine Wessel, who's with us tonight, during her master's thesis in UVM's Field Naturalist program, compiled some data for Mount Mansfield and shows a very similar confirmatory trend here. So the minimum temperature in January, the highest minimum temperature for the month, shows an increasing trend from 1955 to present. And the days with snow cover during winter has shown a decreasing trend. So we're seeing warmer winters, less snow. And one of the things that Catherine was interested in looking at with her thesis was whether some of these historic climate trends have resulted in historic trends in vegetation or not on Mount Mansfield. And so using very similar methods that we just looked at in the last study, these plot level inventories, Catherine went out, but with one important twist, and that is a previous study had been done in 1992 by Bill Howland, so that there was a baseline to compare to 30 years later. And so Catherine worked with Bill, the original study author, to relocate precisely where those original plots were and to go back and re-inventory them to see what changes may have taken place. And this is a map showing the plots that she studied. She actually added 2 additional plots here further south on the ridge in addition to Howland's 4 original plots. And on the right here, we see the changes from 1992 in the lighter green color to 2023 in the darker color. And so for herbaceous species, she saw basically no change. A very slight increase in herbaceous species, but not statistically significant. And for the woody species that can be found in the mountains, she saw a greater change. So from a mean percent cover of about 38% up to 47%, so a 9% increase or so. The trend, Catherine, I think wasn't significant, right? Yeah. So it's a trend, but it's not a dramatic change, okay? And other studies on different mountains that have used similar approaches, comparing like historic surveys with modern ones, have seen similar trends. And so it's an interesting finding, right? We're seeing a little bit of a hint of this sort of increase in woodiness, what you know the plant ecologists would call woody encroachment, that potentially might represent the sort of increase in shrub and Krumholtz communities in the Alpine. But the trend right now is not dramatic, so it's something to keep an eye on, and it underscores the benefits of these long-term studies. And then I'll end with the project we haven't done yet. Maybe some of you thought I was going to talk about this, but we haven't done anything yet, so I didn't have a lot to talk about. And so this is the project we just got funded by the National Science Foundation. And it's a very integrative study that seeks to put together a lot of the elements that we talked about tonight into understanding what's driving biodiversity of alpine plants in the Northeast, and to actually integrate this into some modeling of the future. And so we're really interested in addressing this question: how have alpine plants endured thousands of years of extreme seasonal climate changes, including several warm periods that happened during the Holocene, about 5,000 years ago, where the climate was as warm as it is now. And yet they persisted through this, at least the ones that are out there waiting for us to sample them, despite living at the edges of their range, right? So they occur in these southern fragmented sky islands. So it's quite a feat. And we're interested in these sort of 4 processes as explanations. Microclimate specialization, right? So are there refugia within the mountains where plants can find areas to move around without going extinct during periods of inhospitable climate? Are they plastic in their growth? Can they adjust? Individuals like that 100-year-old bearberry willow, can it adjust to a warm change in climate developmentally without perishing? Or do we see evidence of local adaptation, where populations on different mountains genetically evolve and adapt to their local environments, and that process tries to keep up with the changes as they happen? And overlaid on all of this is this idea that these populations, even though they're isolated from each other, they also maintain some potential degree of connectivity. Even if that's a very rare long-distance dispersal event, we saw that signal of connectivity in Andrea Torell's thesis, suggesting that these populations may still have some degree of dispersal between them. And so here are our sites, just to kind of give you a taste of what's to come over the next 4 years as we work on this project. So we've got 12 different mountain summits that we'll be working on throughout the Northeast, from the Adirondacks all the way up to Katahdin. And it's a big team, and it's a very interdisciplinary team. So we're throwing the kitchen sink at it, so to speak, including a lot of sequencing, not only of modern DNA, the individuals that are out there right now, but also looking into the paleo record, using pollen and plant fossils that are preserved in alpine bogs and lakes, to look at the diversity of the actual ancient communities. We're going to pair that with field measurements of adaptive traits in the communities themselves, using some of the same methods I showed you earlier, some dense microclimate monitoring, and then my favorite, which are common gardens, which I'll just speak really quickly about. So a common garden is basically an experiment, just like Britt Verrico's experiment with red spruce at the bottom, mid, and top of the mountain, where you can collect seed from different populations and grow them in a common environment. That's the common part of the garden, the common environment. And that allows you to look at genetic variation and how they grow and their strategies for adapting, being adapted to different environments. So we're going to look at these 6 different species, which I think I touched on each of them during the talk. I didn't talk about Juncus trifidus, but it's a highland rush, another rush species. And carrying out a common garden experiment in the Mount Mansfield natural area to look at genetic variability across the alpine zones. So with that, I will leave us where we started, looking towards the chin, and say, go out and experience these beautiful areas, but walk softly, and maybe start with a walk with Catherine Russell, who will lead a walk on June 29th at 10 a.m. Where do they meet you, Catherine?
I'm going to be following up with specific information about that,
Okay.
and space will be limited, so please sign up ASAP if you are interested in joining us.
Great. So Catherine's very knowledgeable about the Alpine, and it'd be wonderful to go out and experience that with her. If you're looking for some background reading, this is a really excellent, very accessible book by Nancy Slack and Allison Bell on New England Alpine Summits. And of course, do the rock walk and stay within those lines of white string that you see on the tops of the mountains. So thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Steve. So we have time for like 2 or 3 questions. Yes?
The common garden experiments, where you're looking at the variability from where you gather the seeds from. How much variability is there in multiple seeds from the same plant?
Yeah. That's a great question. We are going to answer that question. I wish I could tell you right now, but stay tuned. So we would refer to those as either full or half siblings. We know they have the same mother plant,
Right.
so they're maternal siblings for sure, but we don't know whether they had the same father, the same pollen donor. It might be a mix of full and half siblings. So the variability will depend on how many different pollen plants contributed to the seed set within a given mother plant.
And even if they did have the same parentage, how much variability might you expect in the physiological measurements?
Yeah, quite a bit actually. Yeah, most of the variability is actually between individual plants, regardless of parentage. And then, depending on the trait and the species, anywhere from say 20 to 40% would be a typical value is variability between sibships from different mother plants. And then maybe another 10 to 20% from different populations. Yeah, so you can sort of take that total trait variation and partition it at different levels.
You need big gardens to pull out what you want.
Yes, yeah, big sample sizes, yeah, precise measurements. Yeah.
Is there understanding for how long, I'm thinking more of the woody species,
Yeah.
so how long some of them live if they grow in different zones? Do they tend to live longer or less long in higher elevations? Is there any kind of
The same species at
Yeah.
different elevations. That's a great question. I don't know the answer. I referenced a book in a few slides by Christian Corner called Alpine Plant Life. It's very comprehensive. I'd be surprised. Is that the spirit of Ethan Allen coming in? Yeah. I'd be surprised if he didn't have some answers to that question. I can sort of shoot off the head, but don't quote me on it. I think it would, plants, they age in a way that's very different from animals, right? And so I would suspect, it's in part related to, their sort of photorespiration and how many free radicals they're generating and like DNA damage and things like that. But also plants have no dedicated germ line the way that animals do, right? So any vegetative meristem can become a flower. And so they accumulate mutations sort of along the way. And so, yeah, I would expect that you would probably see higher rates of that sort of mutational input at higher elevations, but probably fewer cell divisions, so maybe they kind of balance each other out. I don't
So
know.
willow was impressive.
Right, it's super impressive, yeah.
Are the seeds viable? Where's the male? That willow.
I've never seen it set seed. Yeah.
But it produces-
Has anybody that's familiar with that
Produces
plant?
catkins.
Yes, it does produce catkins, yeah.
No, okay.
Yeah.
We'll do one last question. I just want to be cognizant of Echo staff time. Yes?
I have three references to elevations of the elevation at 4393 and 4395.
Oh.
Is this statistically important?
You need a lot of Mount Mansfields to be able to answer that question. I doubt it. I doubt it's statistically important. But it could be a fun question to ask nonetheless.
I have seen it posted. There's 2 different elevations with various sources, so
Yeah.
it is interesting.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. This is a great lecture.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.